Smokey Yunick is one of the most storied characters in NASCAR. He dabbled in all aspects of the sport: crew chief, owner, driver, engineer, engine builder, and car designer. He is best known for his time as a mechanic and engine builder, along with his time as a crew chief, but today we are focusing on his innovations in the sport. The NASCAR rulebook and car now has limited what great minds like Smokeys could do, especially to the scale of what he did. This is NASCAR's greatest innovator, the Smokey Yunick story. Henry Yunick grew up on a small farm in a small town in eastern Pennsylvania. Henry was stated to be a smart kid, but had to drop out of school at age 16 to help run the family farm. According to his daughter, it was around this time he was determined to become a world-renowned motorcycle racer. He was able to get his own motorcycle and took it to the tracks. It turned out that he did not know as much about tuning as he thought he did, as the machine smoked like crazy. The entire race, the announcer called him Smokey, and the next day his friends all made fun of him, calling him Smokey as well. The name stuck from this point to the rest of his life. When he was 19, the Americans had just entered World War II. He joined the Army Air Corps and was a pilot, flying a B-17 Flying Fortress nicknamed Smokey and his Fireman. After over 50 missions in Europe and involvement in the Pacific War in South America, his time in the service was up. After he got back, he moved to Florida at 23 years old because it was warm and looked good. Just a year later, in 1947, he opened a garage in Daytona Beach to repair trucks called Smokey's Best Damn Garage in Town. He had run the shop for 40 years until 1987, when he closed it, claiming there were no more good mechanics. Of course, a man in Daytona Beach in the 1940s and 50s who owned a repair shop would naturally get intrigued by stock car racing. He started to dabble in building engines initially in NASCAR in the late 1940s. So how did Smokey get from not being able to tune a motorcycle to building engines in the pioneer days of NASCAR? Smokey never had formal training for anything he did, but obviously picked up a lot of information by himself. He was a self-taught mechanic, and even taught himself chemistry and physics, which gave him an advantage over others. He quickly gained a reputation for his ability to extract maximum performance from his engines. In 1952, he made his only start in the NASCAR Cup Series in Herb Thomas's famous Hudson Hornet, only to go out of the race on lap 7 with an engine issue. Smokey would field a car less than 80 times throughout his career as a car owner, but would win 9 of them. This included victories with Fireball Roberts and Herb Thomas. Obviously, being a car owner was not a priority for him. Now that we have established some background information on him, I want to go through some incredible stories and accomplishments. These are not chronological, but hopefully the stories have a little bit of continuity. One of his most famous exploits was his number 13 1966 Chevelle driven by Curtis Turner. The car was so much faster than the competition during testing, some sort of aerodynamic enhancement was strongly suspected by other people in the garage. However, the car seemed to be entirely stock as the rules required. A lot of theories were thrown around at the time, but it was eventually discovered that Smokey had lowered and modified the roof and windows and raised the floor. One of Smokey's most well-known incidents involves shoving an inflated basketball into an oversized fuel tank before the car was inspected by officials. When they filled the tank up with the fuel, the tank would appear to conform to regulations. After passing inspection, Smokey would then deflate the ball, pull it out of the tank, and fill the regulation plus basketball-sized fuel tank for the race. As you will notice in the next few stories as well, some of Smokey's best stories come from fuel. He was once accused of using illegal fuel in a race, and when confronted by NASCAR officials, he famously said, "I don't know what you're talking about, but if I did, I wouldn't tell you." After officials busted Smokey with the basketball deflate gate, there was a rule set for how big the fuel tank could be. Smokey conformed to the rules using a legal fuel tank, but realized there was no rule for how long a fuel line could be. With that in mind, he designed a fuel line that went back and forth under the car, over 11 feet long, enabling it to carry as much as an extra gallon of fuel. The year after the device was found, the rulebook was amended to limit the fuel line as well. One time, officials examined and re-examined one of his cars, even going so far as to pull the fuel tank out just to be sure there was nothing strange about it. At the end of inspection, they handed Smokey a list of 9 items that needed revision before the car would be allowed on track. He read the list, thought for a moment, then handed it back to the inspector, saying better make it 10. Then he drove off in the car, without the fuel tank, back to the pits. At a time, there were no rules regarding the temperature of racing fuel in NASCAR. Smokey knew this and would often cool his fuel so much that it was nearly frozen when it entered the fuel tank. As the race went on, the gasoline would heat up and expand, resulting in fewer pit stops. NASCAR officials grew quite suspicious over time, noticing how much better fuel mileage his cars got over competitors, and busted Smokey. This set new rules in place, standardizing the fuel temperature inside of cars. In another incident, Smokey showed up for a race with stock rear fenders that partially covered the rear tires of his Chevelle. The car qualified well due to improved aerodynamics, but the other teams were laughing and wondering how he was going to change the tires during pit stops. After qualifying, Yunick promptly cut out the rear fender openings. The other teams complained to NASCAR, but Smokey said, "The rules say that I can cut out the rear fenders, but it doesn't say when I can cut them." If you could imagine, this led to another rule change by NASCAR. For the 1967 Daytona 500, Smokey built a Chevelle to 7/8 scale. When he went through tech, the car did not match the templates. Smokey said, "Your templates must be off. Hell, there's a stock Chevelle over there in the parking lot. Stick them on that and check them." Sure enough, the templates were off and the car passed through tech. The car was smaller and lighter, allowing the car to cruise to pole position. Unfortunately, engine troubles kept the team from winning the race. This story has been downplayed and even debunked by some, but it is widely accepted by many. For the next year's Daytona 500, Smokey designed another groundbreaking Chevelle, so innovative it didn't pass tech and the car did not even start the race. In 1988, Smokey wrote, "Another advantage I gave up was using nitrous oxide. In the beginning, the rule about gasoline was that you had to use pump fuel, period. Additives, however, were permitted. So I used to spend hours mixing that stuff, nitro, ethane, and alcohol. Then it came to me. Who was going to dispute whether or not nitrous oxide, the most volatile stuff I could imagine, was an additive or not? First I tried mixing it with gasoline, trying to get it into the carburetor. Eventually, I found you didn't have to do a thing except stick the nitrous into the engine compartment in its gaseous form and turn it on. Sure enough, it would always find the carburetor. For a long time, that was how my cars qualified for races. I put a hand valve under the car seat, cut a hole in the seat so the driver could operate it, and let it rip. Just a small amount of that stuff was enough to jack the power to the moon. But when the rulebook unequivocally declared no nitrous oxide, that was the end of it. I quit using it. Beyond NASCAR, Smokey took a shot at the greatest race in the United States, the Indy 500. He actually worked on cars for over 10 years that would compete in the race. This included a win in 1960. Although he made headlines, especially with his innovative suspensions in his tenure, one thing stuck out the most. He was the first to use a wing on an open-wheel car for increased downforce. This was at the 1962 Indianapolis 500. It was monumental. Although it doesn't look like a wing on a car that we would picture today, it influenced every other form of motorsport. This could have potentially led to the era wars in NASCAR just a handful of years later, and the first wing on a Formula One car just 6 years later in 1968. Also designed for the Indy 500, the 1964 Hurst Floor Shifter Special was one of the most bizarre open-wheel race cars of all time. With the off-center cockpit shifting the center of mass to the left, the car was exclusive to ovals and definitely could not be used at road courses. It does look pretty wild though. After these amazing stories, I want to do a quick overview of Smokeys Creations in the racing world, most of which were mechanical innovations. He wasn't just an avid innovator, he was a legit inventor. He held 9 US patents. I'm no mechanic over here, but these were huge creations at the time. Further, he invented a movable racetrack crash barrier using plywood and old race tires. The barrier functions similarly to how today's safer barriers function. I don't want to downplay this because there's a huge passion for Smokey, but he was an avid advocate for driver safety. During his time in NASCAR, he designed and implemented a roll cage that is credited with saving the life of Curtis Turner, who walked away from a violent crash in Atlanta in 1967. Further, he developed innovative reverse rotation engines and reverse flow cooling systems. He was also one of the first mechanics to experiment with using lightweight materials in race car construction, including aluminum and fiberglass. He was one of the first that utilized wind tunnel testing, and he was credited with developing several innovations that are now standard in racing. That is quite the resume. After retiring from racing in the 80s, Smokey was in the first group of 20 men inducted into the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 1990. He was one of 3 individuals ever to be inducted as an engineer. Yunick was the NASCAR Mechanic of the Year twice, and his teams would include 50 of the most famous drivers in the sport, winning 57 NASCAR races, including 2 championships in 1951 and 1953. Shortly after retiring, he wrote, "All along, NASCAR could have gotten me to behave by writing rules without ambiguities because I refused to cheat. There was no craft or fun in that. Whenever a rule appeared outlawing something, I instantly gave it up. I gave up some advantages because of that. If I could lead my life all over again, I'd probably spend it hunting oil instead of racing. Not even racing can compare with what it feels like bringing in the big well." Smokey was obviously frustrated with the rules NASCAR would write in every time he found an advantage. I mean, it was a theme throughout the video. I would share a great innovation story, and it would be followed by a quick rule change. He was a great innovator, not a cheater. Like he said, as soon as they would make a law outlawing something, he'd put it away. For a creative mind like his to be limited must have been so frustrating. In preparation for this video, I read a lot of excerpts from his autobiography, and I definitely recommend checking it out. He has a lot more interesting stories and relatively smaller innovations that he made over the years. Anyways guys, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's something different, but I thought it was very interesting, so let me know what you thought of it. Anyways guys, that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.